to talk about what's going in Europe right now with the Finnish attempting to join NATO and why the US specifically wants this to happen. The US has a long history with Europe and it goes back all the way to World War Two. Now, if we just look at that history for a minute, we'll see that Americans actually lost considerably less economically in terms of human power and financially compared to all the European nations, majority of them, especially Britain, Russia, France. Um, there was no attacks on American soil, there was no loss of American infrastructure, there was no disturbances there compared to Germany, England, France, Russia. So my point is here that America didn't really become a great power until World War Two ended. Now, why did they become so great? Well, World War Two was basically marked the end of the British Empire. And during that time, while Britain was significantly threatened by Germany, they reached out to the US, and the US supplied them with weapons, with food, with commodities, and all this wasn't free. It was for a price. And once the war ended, Britain was in a large amount of debt to the US, along with a few other European nations. Now, they benefited heavily economically from this because they became the new power. They had all these other countries who owed them money, and that was good for them. They've realised from World War Two that if they have another major European conflict, then they can again supply these European nations with arms, with food, with commodities. Like we've seen Australia supply Ukraine with coal. Now, I don't know if that was free or not, but I mean, it's just one example of how Western countries will start supplying these European nations while they're in turmoil. If we can look at Ukraine's grain industry, it's been severely disrupted. Now, the grain prices will increase, and the US also produces grain, so they will have increased prices for their products in that. And I do not think that all these weapons that the US, UK, Germany have supplied to Ukraine have been free. This is all a cost. Now, going back to Finland and Finland's accession to NATO, this is what the Finns and what a lot of Europeans don't understand is the US is not exactly their friend. Imagine you're a neighbor with somebody, and you and your neighbor both have really nice houses, and then you have someone who's a builder, who's a repairman or a handyman, and he comes and says to you, hey, your neighbor has been throwing stuff at your house. Here's a rock, throw it at their house. So then you have you and your neighbor throwing rocks at each other's houses, and you both damage each other's houses, and then the repairman, the handyman comes in and, hey, I'll fix your house if you pay me so much. I'll fix it for you. So, you see, the US is a bit like the repairman. They have a vested interest in seeing a weaker Europe, a divided Europe, a warring Europe, because the US will later come in and supply all the goods and the services, and for a price, of course, for the repair and the rebuilding of the European nation. So it's very important that European nations do not see America as their best friend, because even if they're a part of NATO, I mean, what is NATO? NATO is just a bunch of paperwork that says we're going to protect you if something happens. But if something does happen, there's no one above the US that's going to say to the US, hey, you said you were going to do this, so you have to do it. There's no... Once it gets to the international scene between countries, there is no higher authority that's going to hold these countries accountable to do what they said they were going to do on a bit of paper. Well, if the US doesn't do it, who's going to come and get after them? It's the US. They're the biggest military power in the world. So it's a very big problem that the Finns and the Europeans are having, and this is escalating quickly. In my opinion, it's best to keep peace with your neighbour, in this case Russia. Russia's obviously not right for invading Ukraine, and NATO may also not be right for expanding into the eastern Ukraine. for trying to get Ukraine to become a NATO member, because they clearly know it's going to aggravate Russia. And I think this is what they've been trying to do since the end of the Cold War. They've been trying to break out another major European conflict for their benefit. Um, so, I'm not saying the Russians are the good guys or the US are the bad guys. I think they're all bad guys, really. They're all just trying to, push their agenda. Um, Really, you've got Russians doing what's best for what they think is best for their people and their country, and the US are doing the same. So it's very, I think, back to my point, it's very important that these Finnish and NATO countries do not expect, without a shadow of a doubt, that the US is going to be running to their aid if Russia comes and invades them or does anything. It's the exact opposite. The Finnish ascension into NATO is going to provoke Russia, and it's more likely to cause a major conflict. Now, the Russians may not win that conflict, but the problem is they might come in and destroy the nation, destroy the economy, have half the population flee, similar to what's been happening in Ukraine. Almost millions of people have fled now. The industry is destroyed, infrastructure destroyed, cities are destroyed. Some of them are being completely leveled, the loss of life. It's going to take them decades to recover from this, generations. So even if they lose, the damage is still going to be done. So the Finns need to understand this. The Nordic countries need to understand this. You need to have peace. Try to have peace with your neighbour. Love your neighbour. Don't expect someone from halfway around the world to go out of their way to send you military supplies free if something ever happens, because there's no need for them to do that unless it's in their direct financial interest. And that's what it's all about. It's in their direct financial interest, and the US's financial interest will be to provide arms, to provide supplies to Europe to fight a war amongst themselves at a cost. So I don't want the loss of innocent life in Europe. I just hope someone sees this and understands what I'm trying to say. It's best just to keep the peace and not to aggravate one another or do what might provoke Russia. As bad as they are, just try and keep the peace. If they do go with NATO, and I don't see it going in a good direction, to be honest. That's all I have to say.